So this is the third video on the aggregate demand components. We've already had videos on the C and I components, so now we are on to G, government expenditure. A little bit like we've done before, let's just address, I suppose with government expenditure really there is just one really important aspect that you need to remember in terms of actually what we're talking about here. So the G component, government expenditure, is what we call current government expenditure, okay, as opposed to capital. Because current government expenditure, what we mean there essentially is the day-to-day stuff. Okay, we are not here talking about when the government decides to build things. Big investment projects, big infrastructure projects, those are counted within the I component because they are the creation of fixed capital within the economy. So just a quick example then, which tends to help people kind of get their heads around it. If the government builds a hospital, that goes into I. So when the government actually builds the hospital, buys the equipment to put in it, and so on, that is I. When the government is paying the doctors, the nurses, the administrators, that's G. Also within G is when they buy materials which are consumed through the functioning of the hospital. So the medicines, kind of gloves, sheets, that sort of stuff. That is all considered in G as well. So it's important when you think about government spending, don't immediately assume that as soon as the government is spending money, it is definitely G, because it depends a little bit on what they've spent money on. And it may well be the case that some or all of it actually will show up in the I component of aggregate demand. There is also a slight difference with G compared to the other ones because the government is the only economic actor which by itself can make decisions which affect the whole of the macro economy. So G also involves quite a lot of kind of political ideology at times and kind of decisions along those sorts of lines, which we don't tend to see crop up in the other ones. But let's have a look at some of the things then that we can say will influence the level of government expenditure within the economy. Now, when we think about the ways that the government spends money, we often kind of break it down into automatic fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is what we call the government decisions around taxation and spending, which is what we're talking about here, really. So automatic things are changes in the level of government spending which occur automatically, as the name would suggest. Discretionary are the ones that are made through deliberate choice by the government. So these discretionary ones, these are the ones that, in the UK at least, are generated in the budget, which kind of happens in March. Also increasingly now, actually, in the autumn statement, the Chancellor is starting to make more discretionary fiscal policy measures now. That normally happens in November time. But any changes which are announced there, they are discretionary in nature. We'll have a look at the automatic ones first then. Remember, we're talking about expenditure here rather than tax. So what automatic means is, let's just imagine a situation where the economy enters a recession. So the economy enters a recession, and what happens then is that because in a recession income levels tend to fall, people start to lose their jobs, and generally the level of economic activity starts to decline. What will happen there is automatically the government will be forced to spend more money on day-to-day things just by virtue of the fact that the economy is slowing down. So what happens here is that the government automatically spends more, and that obviously then will increase the G component, and that happens automatically just as a result of the economy slowing down. Discretionary ones are slightly different. Discretionary ones are the ones where there is some deliberate decision making involved here. So what sorts of things will influence the levels of discretionary government spending? Firstly, I suppose we have to address the issue of political priorities. Okay, so different governments, different prime ministers, different chancellors will have different political priorities, and therefore they will alter the levels of spending by government. For instance, George Osborne, who until very recently was our chancellor, his kind of main priority, I suppose, was trying to reach a budget balance. And to do that, he undertook quite a lot of austerity measures, cutting back on spending and so on, because that was his political priority. Now, the new Chancellor, Philip Hammond, we haven't had any firm details as I make this video, but he started to make some noises about perhaps a slightly looser approach to fiscal policy and perhaps a little bit more government spending, because his priorities are slightly different to those of George Osborne. So we do always have to think about the political priorities of the government and the key players within the government. Another factor that we need to think about is the level of debt and deficit within the economy. Now, we're going to deal with both of those concepts a little bit later on in the course, but if the UK government, or any government for that matter, is already quite heavily indebted and is already running a fairly large deficit, then that doesn't necessarily stop them spending money. Governments can borrow money in order to spend more, but it does mean that they might have to take into account the potential kind of dangers of overspending, of running up too much debt. So it's not a limiting factor for a government. If a government can run a deficit, they can spend more than they receive, but it is something that they may well decide to try and take account of when they're making their decisions. Now, in addition to the automatic stuff that we saw on the left-hand side, there may also be some discretionary decision-making based on the level of economic activity. So, for instance, when the economy is booming, the level of economic activity is very high. It may well be the case that there is a bit of a risk of some inflationary pressures feeding in, something like that, and the government may respond by reducing its level of day-to-day spending. Remember that G is one of the components of aggregate demand. So if C and I are doing very well, then the government may actually think, well, we're doing okay here. C and I are generating large amounts of activity. We don't want to kind of add more levels of economic activity because we might push the economy into inflation. So we, as the government, will rein back our spending to try and balance things out a little bit. So the level of economic activity is also going to be a key determinant here. So those are the main factors. It's a slightly different way of thinking about it with G, as I said, because of the fact that it's these decisions that affect the whole macro economy in their entirety. Do be careful as well in economics. If you are dealing with political priorities in an answer of some form, make sure that your answer stays fairly well grounded in economics. By all means, you can kind of you can make judgments of the political decisions that are being made, but try not to make your answers purely about politics. They need to maintain that economic analysis underneath them. So the main things then that affect the level of government expenditure are the automatic, what we call the fiscal stabilizers, which is what you can see on the left. And then when it comes to discretionary, three main things: the political priorities of the government, the level of debt and deficit, and the overall level of economic activity that exists within the economy.